Hello, I'm Neal and welcome to episode 6 of Nothing is Written, a Lawrence of Arabia notebook. It's a scene-by-scene, sometimes even shot-by-shot deep dive into David Lean's 1962 masterpiece, Lawrence of Arabia. And it's a movie that a lot of people list on their favorites. You know, if you made a list of your top 10 favorite movies, a lot of people would put Lawrence of Arabia on that. And I would be one of those people. So let's go. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the frame that starts the beginning of the movie with Lawrence's fatal motorcycle accident and then the memorial service. So in past episodes, we've covered kind of my story, how I was introduced to the movie, gave you some thoughts about some of the different versions of Lawrence of Arabia that have come out over the years. And then we looked at some of the music, the origins of the music for Lawrence of Arabia, and we talked about the overture. And then we looked at the title sequence. So this really, after the title sequence, this is the first episode where we really get into the guts of the movie. We're starting it. We're doing it. So, first scene we're looking at, Lawrence comes out of the little garden driveway where the title sequence started, jumps on his motorcycle, and he takes off. And like every scene in this movie, it gives us some great insight into Lawrence's character, even though he's going to be dead in just a few minutes or a relatively few seconds. He comes out of that beautiful garden. It's like a kind of little country cottage drive, the complete opposite of anything in Arabia, and rides off down this narrow English country lane. And the first thing he sees, it's kind of the first thing you see in the movie, is this warning sign. It's kind of big red danger warning sign, and there's some road works going on there, and it's like danger. It doesn't quite say danger, turn back, but it almost has that kind of effect. It's like danger, go slow, or I can't remember what it says, but big red signs, which he kind of looks at sort of kind of askance and goes past the danger. Lawrence is not frightened of danger. And as soon as he passes out on a motorcycle, he speeds up. So he's going faster and faster and faster, and he gets this smile, this kind of grim smile. And it's interesting, as I mentioned before, looking at the title sequence, there's something in the title sequence that I had thought, maybe this is a suicide. Maybe this is his last motorcycle ride, and it's going to be a suicide or something, because he does a very peculiar thing, which I talked about in the last episode, where he really carefully cleans the motorcycle, and then, you know, he's obviously very, very particular about keeping things clean and everything being perfect. And then he just throws away the rag that he's using to clean things with, which is completely out of character, unless you think he's not going to come back. And that was just kind of my own little take on it. But in any case, as he's speeding along here, he gets this smile, this very grim smile that he's taking a pleasure in the danger. And that's a lot of him throughout this movie, is taking pleasure in the danger and taking pleasure in the risk, and taking pleasure in pushing himself into dangerous situations. So he goes faster and faster, and there's a great little detail of the trees, the shadows of the trees going across his face. This kind of dark and light, and dark and light, dark and light across his face. And that's something that John Box, the production designer of Lawrence of Arabia, David Lean's production designer for many, many movies, that's something he uses in a few different movies, and even talks about that. And in A Passage to India, there's a shot where he describes in a documentary where he talks about this using patterns of light and dark over somebody's face as they're passing through shadow areas. And so I think that's kind of a thing that's one of the things that he has in his bag of tricks, John Box. And of course it is Lawrence. Lawrence is, who is he? Is he a hero? Is he an anti-hero? Is he, light? Is he dark? So he's speeding along the country lane, and the Sunday cyclists show up over this hill as he's speeding along, and they're almost like a bunch of ducks or something. They kind of show up over this hill, and he's speeding along like a rocket. He's this very single-minded, straight ahead, forward movement. And when they come up over the hill in front of him, these bicyclists, they're kind of meandering around. They're the complete opposite. They're kind of nobodies. They're these sort of, we don't care where we're going. We're not in any hurry. They're not the driven hero, anti-hero, extraordinary person that Lawrence is. They're just like us. They're regular people out on a cycling ride. We never see them in the movie after this. We never even really see them that clearly, but they show up in the road ahead of him, and he starts to swerve out of control. And there are these sort of very strange shots of kind of his point of view. The tires of the motorcycle are screeching, and there's a close-up of him gritting his teeth and really straining. And there's another close-up of him gritting his teeth, straining as he's trying to get control of the bike. And I've thought about that. And it's like, it's kind of a weird shot. What's going on there? And what it is, he's trying to get control. And there's a real emphasis in those several shots of him trying to get control, trying to regain control. He's trying to regain control of the motorcycle. And that's Lawrence. It's about control. He's trying to hold on to control at the last minute, holding on to control. And Lawrence is one of the biggest control freaks in cinema, I would say. And it's just control. This is his last moment. Control, trying to get back control. And he loses control, literally, and goes over the side of the road. And we see the motorcycle on its side, the wheels spinning, and the sound. The motor's stopped, but the motorcycle wheels spinning. This kind of zzz, kind of making a whirring sound. And then we have the famous shot of his goggles, which have gotten caught on a bush. And that shot, the shot of the goggles, was cut during one of the many recuts of Lawrence after it was originally released. When they did the restoration in 1989, the really great Robert Harris restoration, and they were able to assemble a lot of the footage that had been kind of cast aside over the years. When they come to David Lean and said, we're doing this, and we've gotten all the old stuff, we're going to put it back together, we're going to put it together just like it was in the very original release. That was one of the first things that David Lean had asked, I think Ann Coates, the editor, when they were looking at the footage, he asked her, did they find the goggle shot? Because he really liked that shot. It was like, did they find the goggle shot? He was really excited that they'd found it and they were able to put it back. So I guess in the previous versions of the film that had been released kind of up until that 1989, that last shot in that opening motorcycle crash was the motorcycle on its side with the spinning wheel. And then you would have gone right to St. Paul's, the next scene. But it's really a wonderful shot. And, Lawrence, or not Lawrence, I may get those two mixed up, but David Lean started out his career as an editor. So the editing, the transitions in all his movies and in Lawrence are breathtaking. One after the other, the transitions and the movement from one scene to the other there's always something extraordinary in it. So going from this close-up of the goggles, cut to, I just snapped my fingers there, I don't know if you heard that. We cut to Lawrence's face, the real T.E. Lawrence's face in the statue of T.E. Lawrence. And it's a great cut. You're looking through goggles. You're looking through someone's eyes. And this movie is going to be a lot about trying to look through Lawrence's eyes, trying to see his point of view, trying to get into his head. And we cut to the bust of Lawrence in St. Paul's Cathedral. In the script, it's really interesting how Robert Bolt has done it in the script. Rather than the goggles being hanging on a branch, he actually has this really cool shot that he's written in the script. And I'll put it in try to put it in the script notes. What he does is the goggles go bouncing up the road and land in the foreground. So we see the goggles, based on Robert Bolt's original script or his original idea, is that the goggles kind of skid up the road and land right in front of us. And then we cut to that bust of the statue in St. Paul's. And he actually says in the description of the bust in St. Paul's, he actually says, he says, cut to the close shot of the blind stone eyes of Lawrence's bust in the chapel of St. Paul's Cathedral. So he's emphasizing in the script that idea of goggles and eyes and seeing. But that transition isn't just a cut. And there's a lot of, or it's not just a visual cut of images. It's not just about the images, what makes that transition, that cut so effective. There's also a sound element in this cut, which really makes it great. And that is this whirring of the wheel of the motorcycle, this kind of whirring of the wheel over the goggles. We see the goggles and you hear this whoosh of the motorcycle wheel we also get at the same time this music comes in, which is the music, kind of organ music from St. Paul's from the next scene. And that starts to come in and they both blend. And then that brings us into the next scene. So it's not just this cut from one to the other, but it's this wonderful bit of sound. And also then the steps, you start to hear steps. It's actually steps on the flagstones of St. Paul's, on the floor. And that brings you into the St. Paul scene. So we have that statue and we pull out, you see his name, T.E. Lawrence, 1888 to 1935. And we go, okay, that's him, that's Lawrence. And also tells you you're in 1935. And then we cut to Brighton, who's will be Colonel Brighton in the movie. He's retired now, we assume, from the army, played by Anthony Quayle. And he's standing next to a priest there. They're looking up at Lawrence, looking up at this man, looking up at the statue. And he says, he was the most extraordinary man I ever knew. That's what this whole movie is about, is somebody who is extraordinary. Extraordinary. Not ordinary, extraordinary. And then the priest says to him, did you know him well? And first of all, knowing. We're going to talk an awful lot about knowing in this. This movie is very much about knowing and what is known. And knowing and knowledge is one of the central themes. So when you're watching this movie, notice how many times knowing and knowledge comes up. There's even, if you want to say no, there's even the pun of know, of K-N-O-W, and then N-O, that idea of no or negation as well. So even that pun kind of plays out a bit. But we'll leave that for now. And also, there's a lot of sex in this movie. Loads of sex in this movie. In Lawrence of Arabia, and knowing as a sort of biblical reference to sex. So-and-so knew so-and-so, and then they begat so-and-so. That is subtly, I don't want to drive the point home too much here, but that idea of knowing as meaning sexual intimacy is also lurks through the whole movie. So whenever you hear the word knowing, think of it also in terms of physical intimacy or sexual intimacy. Even if it's not literally, it can be like sort of about the symbolic relationship between characters or some internal thing going on emotionally between characters. And David Lean, in the 1950s, I think it was the 1950s, had quite a few years of kind of classic Freudian psychotherapy. And so that kind of Freudian theory or sort of Freudian thinking figures a lot into his work. I mean, as it does for a lot of filmmakers throughout a lot of the 20th century and the 50s and 60s especially. So he says, the priest says to him, did you know him well? And Brighton says very humbly, he says, I knew him. And we get a bit of Brighton's character there. And in this opening scene, we're going to see quite a few of the major characters are going to appear in the movie. And we're going to get through what they say about Lawrence, we're going to get some understanding about their own characters. So when Brighton says, I knew him, there's a humility to that. And we get Brighton's like, Brighton is humble. We don't know what the relationship yet is, but we know he really loved Lawrence or, was really close to him. We see that just in his reaction. And there's respect there. He's not exploiting his relationship with Lawrence for any kind of grandiose reasons. He's not, trying to make it about him. It's really about respect and humility before this great person who he did know in his life. And we know in watching the movie, we know that he actually did know him pretty well. But I think Brighton's relationship with Lawrence really is about respect and about humility and knowing his place in relationship to this great man. So the priest comes back and says, well, nil nisi bonum, which is Latin, because he's a priest or he's a cleric of some kind. I'm not sure I don't know what his Church of England sort of official designation would be. But he says nil nisi bonum, which means kind of don't speak ill of the dead. It's the full Latin is de mortuis nil nisi bonum, or those of us who had Latin in high school, which I did, I'm proud to say, de mortuis nil nisi bonum. Great stuff. Latin in high schools. You should have more Latin in high school is all I'm saying. Anyway, so it is shortened to nil nisi bonum, which means it literally means nothing but good. And we'll take a little detour here and talk about nothing. That word nothing or nil is going to come up over and over again. Not Neal, that's me, I'm Neal. But nil, in nil nisi bonum, is nothing but good. So we're starting the movie with that word nothing. Nil means nothing. And that's, again, another theme that's going to come up over and over and over again. So lots of stuff kind of subtly just planted here. Just we're starting out with some of the main themes of the movie, and we're just sticking them in here. So nothing is going to come up over and over again. Nothing, emptiness. And this podcast is called Nothing is Written, because nothing is written is one of the most important lines and themes in the movie. And Lawrence's search for something and instead getting nothing is going to be one of the main things this movie is about. So it's significant that the priest starts out by saying nil nisi bonum. He's just kicking it off with saying the word nothing. There's also a great contrast here. Now, this cleric, priest character shows up only once in the whole movie. He's just in this one shot with Anthony Quayle. But there's already a contrast being made between and throughout this whole scene is setting up Britain. We don't see a whole lot of Britain, but we have a contrast here between this British cleric, this British holy man, and the imam who we're going to see later on in the movie. So we have this character who's thin, he's kind of pointy-nosed, he's quite cold, he's clean-shaven, he's wearing black, and we contrast that with this imam who, in a scene in Faisal's tent later on in the movie, will be reciting the Quran. And we have that contrast. We have here, he's reciting Latin in the midst of this big, giant edifice, St. Paul's Cathedral, gigantic stone building, contrasted with being in the tent, Faisal's tent, this imam who is, although in the scene, we hear it in English, he's reciting the Quran, and that, of course, will be Arabic. And that character is the complete opposite of this priest character. While this one is thin, that imam is kind of fat and big and heavy. This priest character seems very cold. The imam is kind of warm, sort of a warm, with slightly jolly twinkle in his eye. He's also bearded. He's not wearing black. He's actually wears kind of more color. Even the face shape, he's much more kind of broad-faced, wide-faced, unlike the British priest here is very thin. And so we're already setting up that big contrast. Here's the English holy man versus the Arabic holy man, who we will see later. And of course, the whole scene is the color in this this scene is very much somber. It's grays. It's black because, of course, it's been a memorial service. It's not a funeral. It's a memorial service. This is all contrasting with the other world that we're going to see, the other world that Lawrence is going to be in, which is this world of Arabia. So he says, the priest says, did he really deserve a place in here? And he looks up at the sky or somewhere. He looks heavenward and cut to the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. And we do a tilt down. It's a great tilt. As a matter of fact, this shot was used to describe what a tilt was in at USC film school, I think in our very first year of film school. And they sort of said, okay, these are some of the elements that cinema is made of. This is a tilt. A tilt is, of course, the camera rotating up and down. A pan is left to right. And it is pretty great because it's not, I think a lesser director would do the tilt down and then the tilt would end with you on maybe eye level with the people as they're coming out of St. Paul's. In this, the tilt comes down St. Paul's and then ends with you actually looking down on the people. So the tilt kind of continues all the way down, goes down, and you're looking down and seeing the very tiny people like ants coming out of St. Paul's Cathedral. And you get the size of St. Paul's. You get this sense of the big, really, really big, that this building being gigantic and these tiny people, these kind of anonymous people streaming out of there. So in this, the rest of the scene, it's a reporter who's really the only bit of color in there. I guess he's not been in the memorial service, so he's not wearing black. But everything else is sort of black and gray. And he's got a little bit of color, a little bit of brown in his kind of coat that he's wearing. And so you follow him. He's like a sort of slightly brighter figure in the midst of all this sort of somber gloom. And he goes around to some of the major characters who we're going to see in the movie. And we're introduced to them. They're planted. We get a bit of indication of what their relationship with Lawrence is like. And we also get a bit about their characters. The reporter first sees Allenby, General Allenby, or Lord Allenby he is now, and asks him, he says, would you like to say a few words about Lawrence? And he's like, oh, more words. And again, words is going to be a thing in this movie. Words and what is written and language and what is spoken, words. So he gives him a quote, and the reporter's like, yeah, but, kind of tell me more, because he obviously knows the very close relationship they had. The reporter knows this. They had, Allenby and Lawrence had this close relationship. And Allenby just walks away and says, I didn't know him well, and he says it in this sort of sly way that suggests that he probably did know him well. And we know from the movie he actually did, as much as anyone, he kind of did know him. And the line, the way Allenby says it, it's subtle, it's manipulative, it's clever. And that's Allenby. That's Allenby's character. In fact, Lawrence later on says to Allenby, "You're a clever man, sir." And Jackson Bentley, the reporter character later on in the movie, calls him a slim customer. So, the reporter asking him this question, and when he goes around and asks some of these other characters about Lawrence, they actually reveal stuff about themselves. We learn about these characters through how they react to Lawrence, or through how they remember Lawrence, or how they characterize their relationship with Lawrence. So the reporter goes up to somebody else, and it's Jackson Bentley, who was played by Arthur Kennedy. Allenby is played by Jack Hawkins, great British actor Jack Hawkins, by the way. But he goes up to Jackson Bentley, and he recognizes him. He's a reporter. He recognizes Jackson Bentley, who is based on Lowell Thomas, the famous American journalist who wrote about Lawrence. And he says, "Oh, you must have known Colonel Lawrence as well as anybody." And which Bentley runs with, and he says, "Yes, it was my privilege to know him and to make him known to the world." And Bentley makes it about himself. It's the Jackson Bentley story. There's just a couple lines there, but he kind of grabs it and makes this proclamation about how it was him, that it was Jackson Bentley who created Lawrence. Without me, you wouldn't have even known anything about Lawrence. And he concludes by saying, and he was the most shameless exhibitionist since Barnum and Bailey, he says as an aside to a friend he's with. Which again is more Jackson Bentley than, it is Lawrence, but it's also Jackson Bentley revealing something about his own character, that's the thing he spots. And that's what we'll see a lot of in Lawrence Arabia as we watch it, I think, is that the things that we spot in his character are often things that are in our own character. It's that Hamlet effect. People talk about Hamlet, when you think about Hamlet and what his problem is, it's whatever you decide Hamlet's problem is, that's really your problem. You project some of your own experience onto that, and your own experience informs what you think about Lawrence and your judgments about him. So somebody's walking by and hears that comment, "He was the most shameless exhibitionist since Barnum and Bailey," and he's outraged. He taps him on the shoulder, and it's this medical officer now he's a civilian, but it's a medical officer that we'll see later in the movie. He's kind of our nobody character, or our everyman character, and he only appears in a couple scenes at the very end of the movie. And he says he was a very great man, and this guy didn't know Lawrence at all. As a matter of fact, he smacks Lawrence in the face later on in the movie without knowing that it's him. And he explains, he says that, he did have the honor to shake his hand once, even though he didn't actually know him. And Arthur Kennedy, at the end of that little exchange, has got this sort of great look he gives to his friend, like, that about sums it up. That's like, this is just, another one of those guys who thinks they know Lawrence, and, that's just the way they are. And then finally, we have Murray, who was General Murray, played by Donald Wolfett, great British actor Donald Wolfett, who is just in mid-conversation with a friend, who's obviously asking again the same question, did you know him? Did you know Lawrence? And he says, "No, knew him? I never knew him. He had some minor function on my staff in Cairo." And with that, Cairo, bang, we cut to 20 years earlier to Cairo, and we start the story with Lawrence. That's a great transition. Very bold transition. And only somebody who really knows editing as well as David Lean does, and who really knows storytelling, can get away with that kind of transition. We also get a bit about General Murray here, and he really doesn't care. He's probably told, you have to show up to this Lawrence Memorial thing because we need you there because you're a significant part of the Middle Eastern campaign, and we need you there. And he's like, "Oh, okay, I'll show up, whatever." You get a little bit of his reaction there of like, he just couldn't care less about Lawrence. He's just, as far as he's concerned, he just can't see what all the hubbub is about. Like, who cares? Lawrence, why should I even care? Much more important things going on. And he makes it clear, as we'll see in the coming scenes, how much he dislikes Lawrence and how he just doesn't get it. He just doesn't get Lawrence at all. Doesn't understand any of it. But yeah, so he had some minor function on my staff in Cairo. Bang, cut to Cairo, and you're off. So we'll cover that scene next. We'll start with Lawrence in Cairo and the introduction to Lawrence. I hope this has been useful and enjoyable. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments and your experience about the movie. Leave comments wherever you happen to be listening. And you can follow me on Twitter at Rabbit and Crow. All one word, Rabbit and Crow. Also, I just want to let you know we have set up a Patreon for this podcast. If you're not familiar with Patreon, Patreon is a service that allows creators and creative businesses to set up a monthly subscription to support the creative work that you're doing. You can start out by just donating $1 a month. That's all. That's our Michael George Hartley tier. And it goes all the way up to an Ali tier if you want to be very, very generous. So go to Patreon and help us out, and that will allow us to do better work and more cool stuff going on. So it's patreon.com/AUworks. Patreon.com/AUworks. Check it out. Anyway, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time.